Welcome to this lightning talk where I try to cram way too much into 10 minutes talking about my experience using open educational practices in two different institutional contexts. Before we begin, a caveat. I am speaking in my personal capacity of my personal experience here. One semester in Japan does not make me an expert on Japanese higher education, obviously. I offer my observations here in the spirit of sharing and really welcome any connection with or feedback from interested scholars and practitioners. Also, while I'm grateful to the Fulbright program and affiliated organizations, Doshisha University, Kingsborough Community College, and the City University of New York for the support that made this project possible, my thoughts here are strictly my own and do not represent official positions from any organization. Now that that's out of the way, I can say I'm usually a professor of political science at Kingsborough Community College in Brooklyn, New York, but in the fall of 2021, I received a Fulbright to teach at Doshisha University, a prestigious private university in Japan. There are many differences between these two settings, but I want to focus most on educational culture and basic needs sufficiency. Basic needs insufficiency was my original motivation for exploring open education because 70% of CUNY community college students have a household income of less than $30,000 per year, and 55% work more than 20 hours per week at a job. Much of my practice is still informed by the difficult economic and structurally oppressive conditions facing many of my students in Brooklyn. So I was really curious how my version of open educational practices would go over in a much different setting, where most students' basic needs were already addressed and where structural issues, while they still exist, are very different than what I am used to. I also wanted to test out my open pedagogical practices in a setting with a very different higher ed norms. And teaching in Japan would mean that my new students would be much more accustomed to straight lecture and exam-focused classes than many of my students in America have been. I found, however, that there were actually many similarities between my classes in these very different settings. In both places, I had a high proportion of English language learners, meaning that making sure materials were accessible in terms both of access for students with disabilities and in terms of compatibility with digital translation tools would continue to be important. In both Brooklyn and Kyoto, I turned out to have a low percentage of political science majors, meaning that the flexibility I built into my classes in Brooklyn for students to explore their own interests as they pertain to our class topics would likely come in handy. In both places, getting textbooks would be very difficult. In Japan, due to logistics and language challenges. In Brooklyn, it's due to exorbitant costs, so I knew open content and OER would be very helpful. In both settings, reading before class is not really a thing. In Brooklyn, I struggle with getting students to read before class, despite that being a standard norm in American higher education, while in Japan, students are not usually expected to read before class. So my Brooklyn strategies for encouraging, modeling, and scaffolding reading would really be helpful. Neither my students in Brooklyn or Kyoto are likely to be familiar with open educational practices, so I knew I was going to have to explain this sort of weird approach I was taking so we could explore and expand on it together. And then finally, of course, COVID was still ongoing in both places in the fall of 2021, so building in flexibility for due dates and means of participation was essential. Since open pedagogy is impossible to pin down as one specific thing, I want to emphasize that I'm only talking about my iterations and adaptations, which owe a lot to many scholars and practitioners from whom I have learned, and which is not remotely the whole of open pedagogy, just one version out of so many possible ones. The open educational practices I employed in Kyoto include open content, open platforms, open course design, and open activities. I used entirely open content using OER and other freely available materials on the internet that were accessible in Japan, meant all students had immediate access, and since the materials were digital, students who wished to use digital translation tools had that available to them. Using an open platform like the CUNY Academic Commons for my class websites and blogs meant that I was able to avoid using the learning management system at Doshisha, just as I avoid using it at Kingsborough. If you're listening to this and think that sounds awesome, then please do check out commonsinAbox.org because they've made it very easy for any institution to develop their own academic commons. I also use the CUNY instance of Manifold, a scholarly publishing platform, to host my American government textbook. Open course design, I included a slightly scaled down version of my Choose Your Own Adventure syllabus, as my host department was understandably a little surprised by the full Choose Your Own Adventure version. So we compromised on something that still had choice, but was not quite so hard to translate into the local context. The adventures offered still included several creative, alternative, or non-traditional assignment options, like making a meme or reviewing a documentary film. I asked students to blog every week because the frequent low-stakes writing practice helped them engage with our course topics in directions of their choosing while having a real audience for their writing, enabling class members to learn from each other while we all got practice in reading and writing about political science in English. I include flexible participation options and flexible due dates in my course design, which is something I've been working on at Kingsborough before COVID, but especially during COVID, to reduce stress for students and allow a variety of means of participation, so that if and when students have to miss class for illness or any other reason, they're still able to catch up and learn with their class by commenting on classmates' blogs or using social annotation on our assigned readings. All assignments used a form of ungrading, modified self-grading, where I ask students to assign themselves points for each assignment that they submit. This generally leads to more revision and reflection before submission, yielding better work and learning, as well as lower stress and higher grades for students. Finally, I used open activities like active learning through simulations, peer teaching, free writing, and pair sharing to get students more comfortable with participating in class. Pair sharing and small stakes writing in class proved incredibly helpful at Doshisha because it really broke through the taboo of speaking in class and got us all much more comfortable with the idea of sharing our ideas with the larger group. I had pretty good results from this approach in Brooklyn. As you can see, the 3 semesters that were mid-pandemic but open pedagogy all had better grades than the 3 semesters that were pre-pandemic but had less open pedagogy, and the results in Japan were similarly excellent. Overwhelming majority in all 4 sections got A's. But grades are not the whole story, so I'd like to share some excerpts from students' end of the semester self-assessments. Overall, I enjoyed participating in this class. The most memorable activities that we did this semester were the UN simulation and discussions. I was able to earn great experience exchanging ideas with my classmates and teacher, so I want to thank everyone who participated in the class. To be honest, because of this class, my perspective toward international relations, this is a different student, changed. Classes I took during my first and second year of this university made me feel that international relations is vague and not interesting to learn. However, Dr. Brandle has given us many opportunities to think about the IR ourselves and helped a lot in doing this. Also, she encouraged us to participate in the class, and that's why I found out IR is actually a very interesting topic to learn. These reflections, and the one you can see on the screen there, are really everything I could hope a student gets out of the class, so I'm very pleased with these results. I learned so much from my students during the semester, and I have several revised and new practices I've incorporated into my classes now that I'm back to teaching in Brooklyn. A student proposed making their blog out of a Google Doc that they send me a link to instead of setting up their own website, and this has now become one of the most popular ways that students in my Kingsborough class blog. I learned from my students in Japan that I really do need to keep revising course documents like the syllabus and assignment requirements and any assistance or guides that I provide, and that I need to make those available in multiple means like documents, images, and/or videos. In Kyoto, students really appreciated when I used automatic captions during class, so I'm doing that in Brooklyn now too. They also appreciated my attempts at incorporating some Japanese into our slides. And while I can't do that for the 123 languages spoken by CUNY Community College students, it did inspire me to offer a Translate a Week of Slides assignment option so that students can use their knowledge of another language to make a resource for future students. Finally, 2 of the classes I taught were not the usual introductory classes I teach most often, but were more of a selected topics approach. And the students and I had so much fun in those classes because we got to determine together what was the most important for us to learn. So I'm really trying to think about ways to move even further away from the canonical, you must cover these things in an introductory course approach, to a more skip to the good parts approach, working with students to decide what we think are the most important parts. If you've made it this far, thank you tremendously for taking the time. If you have any questions, please email me or find me on Twitter. I'd love to connect. Thank you so much.